So we've talked now about the most important part of diffusing anger. And we've said that it's mindfulness. And we explained that mindfulness is so important that without it, nothing else is going to help. You know, we mentioned some other tools you've got: context, insight, action. But without mindfulness, none of those things are going to help you. We also talked about how mindfulness is a lot like putting on a seatbelt when you get into a car. Now, you young whippersnappers might have a hard time believing it, or maybe it never occurred to you, but there was a time when wearing seatbelts was not a law. People didn't do that, wear seatbelts. Imagine the whole world of people, and I know because I remember this, but imagine the whole world of people going their entire lives, getting into the car, not even thinking about seatbelts, and having to go from that transition to not even thinking about seatbelts to now having to wear seatbelts every time they got into a car. That really happened. And that required a lot of mindfulness. You know, it might have been hard at first to remember to do this, but it wasn't impossible. And it didn't stay hard for forever. Given enough time and repetition, most of us got very good at putting on our seatbelts. And now for the vast majority of us, it's not even something we even have to think about nowadays. That's how automatic it has become anytime we get into a car. In fact, if I get into a car, and remember, when I was a kid, we didn't have to wear seatbelts. It wasn't a law. But I went from that to now, if I get into a car and for whatever reason I can't put on the seatbelt, if I can't find it, or the seatbelt's broken or whatever, and I can't put it on, I just don't feel right. That's how automatic and reflexive and a natural part of my life putting on a seatbelt has become, and wearing a seatbelt. So putting forth an effort to be mindful when it comes to your anger is important. It's doable. It's no different than learning to put on your seatbelt every time you get into a car. With some very reasonable effort and repetition, you can learn to be mindful with regards to your feelings. Do you remember what I said that you're trying to be mindful of? When I say the most important part is being mindful, what are you being mindful of? Do you remember what we said? Well, are you trying to be mindful of when you're already angry? You're just pissed off beyond belief. Is that the time you want to be, you catch yourself? Oh, okay, I recognize now what I'm feeling. Well, not exactly. But there's nothing wrong with catching yourself when you're already, your feelings are already really volatile. There's nothing wrong at all with, being super pissed off, yelling at people, and then realizing, coming to your senses and realizing that now you're very pissed off and you've allowed yourself to get that far. Because even mindfulness in that moment can help you to say, okay, I need to get out of the situation now. I've already said things and behaved in ways that I didn't want to. So let me get myself out of this situation until I can apply context, insight, and those sorts of things. But the real objective, remember the real objective we said with this mindfulness is to recognize simply when your feelings begin to go in a different direction than where they were at before. That is the real objection. That is the real objective, because if you can catch yourself at that moment, then you can avoid all that. And your mind is the clearest right then in that moment. So I told you that the way I learned how to do this, I figured that the easiest way to do it was just to catch myself when I go from feeling pleasant to not feeling pleasant. And you know how that feels in your body, to be angry or frustrated. It doesn't feel good. It makes you feel unpleasant. I don't know how else to describe it, but it makes you feel unpleasant. So I realized that all I need to do is be mindful of when I go from feeling pleasant to not feeling so pleasant. If I can catch myself in that instant, oh boy, got all sorts of options. My thinking is still clear, and I can avoid all sorts of things right there in that moment. Just catching myself when I go from feeling one thing to now my feelings are starting to go in a different direction. So that's what I would do. I'd start mindfully watching for those moments when I'd go from feeling pleasant to not feeling so pleasant, and then making concrete decisions in that moment. So mindfulness, catching ourselves at that very moment when our feelings just go from going in one direction to now they're going in a different direction. And then we talked about how powerful your tools are, which are applying context, insight, and action. Taking time to consider the context of the specifics of what is beginning to make you angry and re-examine it, put it into context, think about who it's coming from, thinking about what their intentions might be, putting that into context, putting into context how they might be feeling or what's going on in their life right now, things like that. Insight, taking time to understand a thing fully and intuitively, because if you do, if you understand a thing intuitively and insightfully with discernment, you might feel entirely different about that thing than how you feel about it when you don't apply insight or discernment. And finally, action, making concrete decisions to change topics of conversation or leave environments entirely, or taking time out so that you can go off to yourself and think it through more alone without the danger of saying or doing things towards somebody you might later regret. But here's the final thing we will say about diffusing anger for this series of Orange Slice episodes. Should it always be our goal to diffuse the anger we're feeling? No, that should not always be our goal, because in lots of cases, anger is exactly the appropriate thing to be feeling. If somebody were to try to harm my daughter, for example, that's not the time for me to go off and try to diffuse my anger. That is the time to act in the moment and allow my anger to fuel my response. So when we're talking about diffusing anger, don't forget that trying to diffuse your anger is not always the proper thing. It's not always the proper thing to want, and it's not always the proper thing to try to do. Diffusing anger is something that we want when we're talking about situations where we want to make absolutely sure that we're not thoughtlessly allowing our emotions to affect our decisions and actions without first taking time to think things entirely through. We don't want to be like somebody who gets blind drunk and then in the morning they wake up and they're just full of anxiety. Oh my gosh, what did I say last night? What did I do? Did I make a fool out of myself? Who did I sleep with? You know, that's what happens when our emotions get very volatile and we act and do things in that blind state. It's like being blind drunk. For example, my friend having different political views than I have is not an appropriate situation for rage. It's not an appropriate time for rage. The situation does not reasonably call for anger and rage. My daughter making a mistake that all children make, not an appropriate time for rage, right? The situation does not reasonably call for intense anger or rage. Somebody accidentally cut me off in traffic, not an appropriate time for intense anger or rage. Dropping my cup of coffee walking out of Starbucks, not an appropriate time for rage. Rage is a legitimate emotion, and as such, it has its appropriate times. Situations like I mentioned before, a total stranger walks up and wants to try to hurt my daughter. Somebody attacks me in an alley. Somebody steals your car. I'll let you imagine more scenarios if you like, but one that just come to me, I remember on 9/11, on the terrorist attacks in New York. I remember, like everybody, glued to the television, hearing these reports come, these terrible reports coming out of New York and around, Pennsylvania, and Pentagon, stuff like that. These stories of bravery stories of people who would never get to see their families again. And I remember walking around my apartment with my fists just clenched in a terrible rage. I was so angry at the injustice of that whole day. So certainly an appropriate time for rage. In these cases, in cases like this, do you see that no matter how much mindfulness, context, or insight you apply to the situation, it's not going to make the rage go away? Because what happens? In these cases, the more insight and context you apply, the more you see that your rage is actually more justified than you even thought it was before. You see, in these sorts of situations. So how about a situation where rage or anger is totally appropriate, but there's no solution? For example, how about when we realize for the first time the full extent of the abuses that many of our parents subjected us to all the lives of our childhood? You know, we see now how unacceptable the gravity of those injustices. How about other injustices we've suffered, but that are in the past and that can never be changed? Remember, these are situations, again, where anger and rage is completely appropriate. No amount of mindfulness, context, insight, or even action is going to make us see that that anger is not justified. In fact, the opposite is true in cases like this. The more insight and context we apply, the more we see just how justified our anger and rage is. So, what to do in these cases? The answer at first is to allow ourselves to feel the anger. At first, for a while. That's entirely appropriate. But you want to talk to other people in your lives, and like your kids, your husbands, your wives, your friends, maybe even some of the people at work. And you want to let them know that your moodiness and your frustration is not their fault. Avoid people for a while if you have to, so that you don't take the anger that you're justifiably feeling out on those who don't justifiably deserve to receive that sort of treatment or receive poor treatment by you. But is it okay for this anger and this rage to go on for forever? No, it's not okay for it to go on for forever. In these cases, the objective is to eventually achieve acceptance. You see, it happened in the past. It can't be changed. The people who are responsible for it may never accept responsibility for it, may not want anything to do with that, may not even acknowledge that you were treated unjustly. So the rage and the anger is appropriate, but it can't go on for forever, because eventually what you want to achieve is acceptance. And remember that acceptance is not an agreement with a thing. It's not saying, okay, I'm perfectly okay with that happened. Acceptance is simply letting go of the wish that things could have happened differently. The reality is that probably for the rest of your life in situations like that, if you sit down and you take your mind back there and you start thinking about all that injustice, all that tremendous injustice, you will feel angry, because it did happen. It will never not have happened. So you're always going to feel anger about it when you sit and think about it. But acceptance is, for the most part, not dwelling on it day by day. You're accepting or coming to peace with the fact that it did happen and that it can't be changed. And this acceptance allows you to let go of it for the most part and move on, not thinking about it anymore.